Hello, this is Chris Ferrigno. In this discussion, we'll go over the very basics of the nervous system. We're really interested in the peripheral nervous system, how information comes in, meaning sensory information, to the spinal cord, and how information comes out, meaning motor information, to muscles and other areas. The nervous system is divided into two parts. We have the central nervous system, which is specifically the brain and the spinal cord. Everything else outside that brain and spinal cord comprises the peripheral nervous system. Such structures include all the peripheral nerves that exit the spinal cord, that go out to the extremities and out into the viscera. It includes the autonomic and somatic nervous systems, including the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems that fall under the larger autonomic category. The spinal cord is descending down through the spinal canal or the vertebral canal, and along the way it gives off spinal nerves which exit out at each vertebral level. Here we can see the spinal cord exiting out this area called the foramen magnum. So that's the start of the spinal cord, and it descends down the vertebral column and in that spinal canal. And it ends at this level, roughly the L1 vertebral level. There are 8 cervical spinal nerves exiting out through each opening or intervertebral foramen formed by 2 adjacent vertebrae. In total, there are 31 spinal nerves. Covering the spinal cord are several layers of tissue called meninges that help to protect the spinal cord and help to keep cerebrospinal fluid within and around that spinal cord. These tissue layers help to form spaces or potential spaces that surround the spinal cord as well. Lastly, we'll see 3 specializations at the end of the spinal cord: the conus medullaris, the filum terminale, and the cauda equina. So once again, there are 8 spinal nerves in the cervical region. The numbering starts at the very first spinal nerve, so that would be C1. Note this line right here indicates the spinal nerve, and note that C1 exits above the first vertebra or the atlas. C2 exits above the second, and so forth all the way down. C7 exits above the 7th vertebra. However, we have a C8 spinal nerve that exits below the C7 vertebra. So, in summary, in the cervical spine, all of the cervical spinal nerves except for C8 exit above the corresponding vertebra. Once again, C8 exits below C7, because there are only 7 vertebrae, but 8 spinal nerves. And then from there down, all the spinal nerves exit below the corresponding vertebra. So T1 is below the T1 vertebra. The T12 spinal nerve is below the T12 vertebra. The L1 spinal nerve is below L1, and so forth and so on, with L5 below the L5 vertebra, all the way down through the sacral and coccygeal region. Okay, so let's try a few of these. So here we have a spinal nerve exiting out below T2 and above T3. Recall that in the thoracic spine, and really anywhere below C7, the spinal nerve is named after the level of the vertebra below which it exits. So here's the T2 vertebra. So this must be the T2 spinal nerve. Same thing here. This would be the T12 spinal nerve exiting out below the T12 vertebra and above L1. So this would be the T12 spinal nerve. Going back up here, what do you think would be the name of the disc? Well, the disc has a slightly different nomenclature. We name the disc according to both the spinal levels it sits between. So this would be a T2, T3 disc, or T2, T3 intervertebral disc, and this would be a T12 L1 intervertebral disc. Well, since that was so much fun, let's do one more. Here we see a spinal nerve. It's exiting out below what seems to be, let's see, C1, C2, C3. That makes this C4, and recall that the spinal nerves in the cervical spine, with the exception of C8, are named for the vertebra they exit above. So this would be C4, so this would be the C4 spinal nerve. And this is just another image that has a very nice illustration of what we just said. So here we see the C1 spinal nerve and its associated structures exiting out from above the atlas. And then we have C2 exiting out above C2 or the axis. And then C3 above C3, etc., all the way down. C7 exiting above C7, and then C8 exiting below C7. Once again, the spinal cord is covered by 3 layers of tissue or meninges. Here on this image, we can see these layers of meninges shown here in the black, and just closely adherent to it, the green, and then the blue. Here in the black is the dura mater. The dura mater means tough mother. And it's called tough mother because it is very strong, very dense, and it's a nice protective layer overlying the spinal cord. We can see the dura mater shown here in gray as well as here shown in gray. And here on this image, this has the same color coding as this image over here. So the outer black layer will be dura mater. The dura mater extends through the foramen magnum, so we can see this black extending out through the foramen magnum onto the outer spinal cord region. We can follow the dura mater all the way down to the vertebral level of S2, where it ends. Now, all within this black region is the arachnoid mater shown in green, closely adherent to the dura mater. So here it's a little bit easier to see. We have the dura mater in black, and then in green the arachnoid mater. Now note there is no space between the dura and arachnoid mater. Rather, it's a potential space. Now in a cadaver, the arachnoid mater falls away from the dura mater and onto the pia mater, which overlies the spinal cord proper. However, in a live human, there is this space between the arachnoid and the pia. And in this space circulates cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. The CSF is produced much higher up here in the ventricular system of the cerebrum in the skull. And then it descends down into the subarachnoid space to bathe the spinal cord. Note that the arachnoid mater, similar to the dura mater, extends out from the cranial vault all the way down to the S2 vertebral level. The third layer of meninges is the pia mater. Pia mater means delicate mother, and it is quite delicate. It overlies the spinal cord as a very thin membrane. If there are little indwellings, the pia mater follows those indwellings in and out. So again, it follows the contour. So the pia mater separates the overlying cerebrospinal fluid from the spinal cord itself. However, that CSF diffuses through the pia mater to get to the spinal cord. Distally, we can see the pia mater extending down to the termination of the spinal cord at the L1, L2 vertebral level, and then extending further down as a small filament called the filum terminale, which tethers the end of the spinal cord to the dural sac. Then the dura mater extends down to the coccyx, as well as the pia mater. It's a little hard to see here, but we have pia mater here extending to the end of the dural sac. Then we have dura and pia mater continuing on to the coccyx. This internal part is called the filum terminale internum, and this extension here is the filum terminale externum. Here in another view, we see that filum terminale internum within the dural sac, the dura mater being black, the blue being cerebrospinal fluid being contained within this dura mater, and this filum terminale internum extending down to the level of S2. Here in this picture, we see a few other specializations of the spinal cord, the inferior spinal cord. So this is the spinal cord terminating at the level of L2. Sometimes we describe it as between the level of L1, L2. Some folks say it's L1, some folks say it's L2. It's in this region. At the very inferior aspect of the spinal cord is the conus medullaris. So in this picture, it shows it somewhat cylindrical, and in this picture, it shows it somewhat pointed. So the conus is this tapered inferior end of the spinal cord. Also coming off the inferior spinal cord, not seen here, but seen over here, is the cauda equina. Cauda equina means horse tail. So this, by anatomists, looks like a horse's tail. What are these? These are ventral and dorsal rami. We'll discuss that in a minute. These are ventral and dorsal rami coming off the inferior spinal cord, mostly off the conus, that descend down to exit out their corresponding spinal level. So these might be the lower lumbar spinal nerves coming out. These would be the sacral spinal nerves and a coccygeal spinal nerve down here. So in this image, we can see where and how the cerebrospinal fluid is produced and circulated. Here are the ventricles within the cerebrum. This is called the lateral ventricle. There's two of them. Here is the third ventricle, surrounded somewhat by the lateral ventricles, and here's the fourth ventricle. Within the ventricles are special cells called ependymal cells. These ependymal cells are contained within tissue called the choroid plexus. Cerebrospinal fluid is formed in the choroid plexus that lines these ventricles. So they're produced here, and then they circulate out from the lateral ventricles into the third and fourth ventricles. Now there's also choroid plexi within these third and fourth ventricles, so it's produced within all the ventricles. Ultimately, it gets dropped down into these regions called cisterns, and from these cisterns, the cerebrospinal fluid flows down the spinal cord and up and around the brain. So again, the CSF in the subarachnoid space between the subarachnoid mater and dura mater is flowing down and bathing the spinal cord, and it provides nutrients and also protection for the spinal cord. So the CSF is found in the subarachnoid space and also a little bit in the central canal of the spinal cord. So here is the central canal. It's rather closed on a cadaver, but in young individuals, it's often open. In older individuals, it often closes. And then the CSF would be contained around here, just outside the pia mater, which is closely adherent to the spinal cord itself. Now, as a clinician, you may want to look at the cerebrospinal fluid, so you may want to do a spinal tap. You may do this to figure out if there's any bacteria growing in the cerebrospinal fluid, or you may want to look at some other compounds within the fluid. So imagine you want to take a needle and you want to puncture the dura mater. So you want to go through the black dura mater, the arachnoid mater that's closely adherent to it, to get into the subarachnoid space. Which approach would you be most comfortable taking? Would you like to put a needle here, where you go into the small subarachnoid space here in blue, or would you like to go into this space? Remember, there's cauda equina going in here. So it's not absent of nerves, but it's certainly less dense of nerves. Hopefully you'll want to go take this route where you puncture the dura mater and arachnoid mater at this level. So how do you know on a patient where you are with respect to the levels of the vertebral column and thus the level of the spinal cord? Well, a reliable landmark is the top of the iliac crest, which puts you at the L4 vertebral level. So you simply put your hands on the patient's waist, press down till you get to the top of the iliac crest, and move. You can take your right hand here and your left hand here, and you connect the dots, so to speak, and you would insert the needle at that level. Now again, it's safer to go in at this level than it is to go in at this level. Obviously, again, you have some nerves around here. I've been told it's like taking a needle and trying to pierce cooked spaghetti in a pot of boiling water. While it's potentially possible, if you go in at a very methodical, slow way and you listen to your hands, in other words, you feel for certain layers of tissue that you poke through, it's quite a reliable and safe method to withdraw cerebrospinal fluid. Now, another specialization of the meninges is an extension of pia mater. So here we have the pia mater enveloping the spinal cord. There are some extensions of pia mater that extend from the pia itself out to the arachnoid/dura mater, and these are called denticulate ligaments. Now, I'm not a big fan of finding these in the lab, but appreciate that they do a couple things. They tether the spinal cord within the greater dural sac. So in other words, it keeps the spinal cord from slapping left and right. It also separates, what we're going to learn are the ventral roots and the dorsal roots, or the ventral rootlets and the dorsal rootlets in the spinal canal. So here we would have that denticulate ligament separating the ventral from the dorsal back here. I'd like to start talking about how information is transmitted from the spinal cord out into the periphery or from the periphery into the spinal cord. Before we do that, let's briefly maybe review, I hope, the various types of neurons. So here we can see unipolar, bipolar, pseudo-unipolar, and multipolar. Bipolar neurons are usually special sensory neurons. So we'll be talking about those much later on, particularly when we get into the head and neck and the cranial nerves. Unipolar, we're just going to skip for now. Let's focus here on the pseudo-unipolar and multipolar neurons. Here we have a pseudo-unipolar neuron. We have some sensory receptor. This is key because a pseudo-unipolar neuron is going to be associated with a sensory neuron. So bringing information from the periphery up ultimately to the spinal cord region. Note that the cell body is located out here somewhere in the middle of this long axon. Multipolar neurons, on the other hand, transmit in this direction, and they go from a dendritic region through a nucleus that's located close to the one side here, the dendritic side. The action potential would transmit through a very long axon and ultimately synapse somewhere out here in the periphery, let's say at a muscle. So here we see a sensory neuron. This is that pseudo-unipolar neuron with a cell body located within the axon itself. It's communicating with what we see as an interneuron, another type of multipolar neuron. And this multipolar neuron might be getting information from this sensory neuron and many other neurons as well connecting into it. Then ultimately we have a motor neuron, again a multipolar neuron, that's sending a signal down the axon to, let's say, a muscle. So here we see the cross-section of a spinal cord. In this region we see one of those pseudo-unipolar neurons,
And here is obviously a very basic demonstration of one of those multipolar neurons. So here's a pseudo-unipolar neuron on the motor side, and here's a multipolar neuron on the motor side. In this area, we have gray matter and white matter. So this is the spinal cord right here. Okay. The pia mater would be closely adherent, here shown in purple on my screen. You can see that pia mater goes in through all these indwellings there, and maybe, let's say, this little one right there as well. This is dorsal. This is ventral. This is posterior. This is anterior. You can always tell where dorsal is because of where this little bulging occurs. This is called the dorsal root ganglia. So whenever you look at a cross section, either as an illustration or even in the body, you're going to look for the dorsal root ganglion, and that's going to help orient you to the dorsum of the spinal cord. Again, this is gray matter, this is white matter. What does that mean? Well, this white matter is filled with axons of neurons that have myelin. Myelin is the outer covering of an axon that helps speed up its transmission. Gray matter, on the other hand, doesn't have myelin. This is where most of the cell bodies and synapses are located, and those are unmyelinated regions of either pseudo-unipolar neurons or multipolar neurons. And then once a synapse occurs, let's say we have sensory information coming in, we'll have a synapse here with another neuron that will then either continue around here to the motor neuron in the case of a reflex, or if it's sensory information, it will come in here, synapse with another neuron, exit out in some direction into the white matter, and then ascend up towards the brain. And once you get into that ascending region, you want to have myelinated axons. So that's why we have all this white matter out here, serving as the superhighway of sorts for fast transmission. Similarly, let's say we have a signal coming down from the brain. That signal will travel through the brainstem into white matter tracts, say in this region or in this region, and descend down. And when it's ready to exit, let's say in the neck at the cervical spine, it's going to try to go out to the arm. It will then come into this region and then synapse with this cell body of this motor neuron, which will then exit out. So now let's focus on this gray matter. We have this butterfly-shaped structure of gray matter. Again, this is kind of the business district. This is where things are coming on, coming off the spinal cord, or entering on and exiting off the spinal cord. So this is where all those synapses are occurring. Anteriorly, we have a ventral horn. The ventral horn is going to consist of many cell bodies. And as we move dorsally, we'll have a dorsal horn that has cell bodies of neurons that are communicating with the pseudo-unipolar neuron. Remember, the cell bodies of pseudo-unipolar neurons are here in this area called the dorsal root ganglia. But in the dorsal horn, there are cell bodies that are receiving information from this pseudo-unipolar neuron that are going to exit out into these white matter tracts to ascend up. So let's now extend outward from this region. We have an incoming sensory neuron. We have an outgoing motor neuron. Note that the sensory neuron is transmitted only in this dorsal region. This dorsal region is called the dorsal root. It's comprised of many small rootlets or dorsal rootlets. The dorsal rootlets and dorsal root are only sensory neurons. They only transmit the axons of sensory neurons. And within this dorsal root is this dorsal root ganglion. On the anterior side, the motor neurons are transmitted via the ventral root and rootlets. Only motor neuron, or the axons of motor neurons, are found in this ventral root and rootlet. But note they merge here in this area called the spinal nerve. So a spinal nerve is mixed. It has both sensory and motor information. We can see the same thing here. Here, it's a little hard to see. That's your dorsal root ganglion, carrying blue. Blue would be sensory. The ventral rootlets carrying motor information. These fibers are merging here in this region. Note further laterally, there are ventral structures and dorsal structures that are also mixed with sensory and motor information. We're going to get to that in just a minute. So again, let's go further laterally in this region. I'm going to draw in a couple more segments. So here's the spinal nerve, and it's going to extend outward this way. And there will be a small structure called the dorsal ramus going off dorsally. And then we have a larger ventral ramus extending ventrally. So this is the dorsal ramus. I'm just going to put DR. And this is the ventral ramus for VR. Here we can see that dorsal ramus and then ventral ramus. Now I want to turn your attention over to this area. Here we've covered all of this already. We have the spinal cord, we have the dorsal horn, we have the ventral horn in the gray matter. We have ventral rootlets and comprising of ventral root, and dorsal rootlets comprising of dorsal root ganglia, a spinal nerve, and here we see a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Note that the dorsal ramus is going dorsally to the deep back area, both into the muscles and also coming from the skin or the cutaneous areas of the deep back. So this would be in midline, and this would be starting to extend around. If this was in the thorax or in the abdominal region, this would start to extend around the lateral sides of the body. So note the cutaneous regions served by the dorsal rami are very close to the spine itself, and the muscles that the dorsal rami serve are very close to the vertebral column or the spine itself. The ventral ramus serves everything else. So most of our peripheral nerves that we discuss are formed by ventral rami. Now realize that ventral rami are carrying motor signals out to muscles. In this case, it's to the trunk muscles. Let's say these are abdominal muscles, maybe some muscles in between the ribs. But if this was in the arm, this would be taking nerves to serve muscles in the arms themselves, such as, let's say, the biceps in the arm, triceps in the arm, or if it was in the leg, it would be descending down the leg to end up serving the leg muscles, like the quadriceps muscle. Also, note that we have some cutaneous nerves serving essentially the skin region. And these are mostly sensory, but they also have some motor fibers, we'll talk about that later, that are coming in through this ventral ramus. Now this is a peripheral nerve formed by the ventral ramus. And here would be the ventral ramus, roughly in this area. And then that cutaneous or sensory information would be coming in to the spinal nerve. And if it was sensory, it would be going up this way through the dorsal root ganglion into its cell body, and ultimately into the dorsal root, and ultimately into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So let's go back again and talk about some basic nomenclature. I've been using the words sensory and motor. Another word for sensory is afferent or afferent information. So if I say afferent information or afferent information, I'm really talking about sensory. Motor information is also called efferent information. So afferent information is coming into the central nervous system. Efferent information is moving out from the central nervous system. So here's a little mnemonic, same. S is paired with A, so sensory is paired with afferent, and M is paired with E, or motor is paired with efferent. Note that here in the spinal nerve that both afferent and efferent information is being transmitted, but in the ventral root/rootlets, only efferent information is being sent through that, and in the dorsal rootlets, only afferent information is being sent through those structures. So we have afferent only, efferent only, mixed, and now you guys know what a dorsal ramus is. Note that a dorsal ramus is mixed as well because that's sending motor information out to muscles of the deep back and bringing cutaneous information in from the deep back, as well as the ventral ramus. Here's the ventral ramus on this side, but here we can see the ventral ramus being mixed as well with motor and efferent information, as well as sensory or afferent information being transmitted. So we have mixed, 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 and although it looks like a dorsal root ganglion is mixed, realize that that is only sensory information at this location, as well as the dorsal root. And then the ventral side here is all efferent information, as well as the dorsal horn, as well as the ventral horn. We have only sensory information, and we have only motor information. Now, for the most part, this sensory and motor information, or afferent and efferent information, is pertaining to what's called somatic information. This is stuff that we're aware of. So when we feel something, that sensory information, that's somatic information. And that when we want to move a muscle or we want to move a body segment, that's somatic information as well. We also have visceral information that we're not completely aware of, or we don't have control of. So in this simplified drawing we've been looking at, we've seen general somatic information coming in, dorsal root ganglia, cell bodies into the dorsal horn, and motor or efferent information coming out. Well, I haven't been completely truthful with you guys up to this point. I've left a few things out. We had this dorsal horn, we have this ventral horn, we have another horn called the lateral horn. Lateral horn is important because it carries visceral efferent information. Now, again, this is information that we don't necessarily have control over. It's information going to organs, it's going to smooth muscle, it's going to areas in the skin, let's say like the piloerector muscles, which are little small muscles that help to stand up our hairs, right? When we see something scary, let's say, or we get a chill, it's going to cardiac muscle, etc. That input is in part coming from this area called the lateral horn. That lateral horn is going to send motor information out. Again, this is all motor through the ventral root. Through the spinal nerve, it's commingling with sensory and other general motor information. And then ultimately, if it's going to the deep back, it'll go out through the dorsal ramus or through the ventral ramus if it's going to the rest of the body. When we're talking about somatic afferent information, we call that general somatic afferents, or GSA. And this is stuff that's coming from the skin or information coming from muscles and tendons and connective tissue, such as what we call proprioceptive information, or afferent information coming into our central nervous system to let us know where our body is in space. We also have general somatic efferent information. That's this blue line, information going to skeletal muscle. And then we have information coming from our viscera called general visceral afferent, or GVA information. and then outgoing information to the viscera or GVE information. So you may hear me just say GSA, GSE, GVA, or GVE, and realize all that information is traveling through a spinal nerve. All that information is traveling through a ventral ramus, and all that information is traveling through a dorsal ramus. But only afferent information is coming through the dorsal rootlets, and only efferent information is coming through the ventral root and rootlets. So here we have that spinal nerve here. Here's the dorsal ramus, ventral ramus. These are dorsal and ventral rami. Here we can see in this area, a spinal nerve, the dorsal ramus and ventral ramus. We can map certain areas of the skin are served by certain spinal nerves. So here, this would be the spinal nerve. For instance, the C6 spinal nerve, this is the C6 spinal nerve. The area of the skin served by that is this general region. So the thumb and the lateral forearm, if this person's in the anatomic position, it would be the lateral forearm. All that means is that if you were to test this area, so if you were to lightly rub or do a little pinprick onto this area, that signal is ultimately destined to come up through the ventral ramus of C6, through the dorsal root ganglion of C6 into the dorsal roots of C6 and the spinal cord. Conversely, if you were to rub the inside of the arm, that would be the T1 dermatome, derma meaning skin. So this is the area of skin that is served sensory-wise by the T1 nerve root right here, and these structures. So this dorsal root ganglia, this spinal nerve, and the ventral ramus of T1. As we get into the limbs and a little bit into the thorax and abdomen, we will talk extensively about dermatomes. So just remember that a dermatome is an area of the skin that is served by one particular spinal nerve. Thank you for your attention to this discussion on the nervous system. As always, please let me know if you have any questions or comments. You can always email me or just come to my office.